State recognized presence of the jury. Okay.
Yes.
All right, welcome back, folks. Sorry for the interruption.
All right, we were talking about loud noise in the jail.
Yeah, we were talking about the electronic doors in the jail. One of the things that we spoke about, Mr. Loyd and I, is the idea that the door that goes into his block or his area in the jail, it makes a very loud click noise that's triggered from the guard station. And so the guards will walk to the door, they'll yell something to the sheriff or deputy or whatever. He'll push a button, he or she will push a button, and the door will go, like, make a really loud click noise before they can then pull the door open. And this is a noise that he hears however many times a day, probably 50 times a day. He knows when the guard yells that noise is coming, and still, every single time it happens, he jumps, and he has an emotional reaction to it. He talked about ways that he tries to kind of distract himself, or put his fingers in his ears, make noise, talk to somebody else, just kind of do something to try and distract himself so as not to jump, and he's unable to do it. It's a very good example of the hypervigilance that we spoke of, and also highlights the next criteria for PTSD, which is avoidant behavior. The idea that once you've identified something that triggers you, you work to avoid it, okay? So this involves not only behavior in the external sense, going out into the world and avoiding things, but also avoiding thinking about them. I'm sure you've all heard the terms compartmentalization or repression. The idea that when you have something that you don't like thinking about, you push it out of your mind. You don't allow yourself to think about it. You kind of shove it in a corner and don't look at it. And we all have things like that. We all have things that we don't like to think about that we push out of our mind. But in this case, Mr. Loyd specifically avoids thinking about a lot of the experiences that he went through as an adult, the chicken robberies, his friends being killed, the violence in his neighborhood, things of that nature. And also from an external behavior standpoint, he talked about avoiding things like that startle response, that click noise that sets him off even though he knows it's coming.
You had mentioned earlier that he was able to make really good money delivering chicken. Mm-hmm. Was there an avoidance issue that was taking place after he had been robbed?
He did talk about wanting to avoid that experience, that job, trying to avoid that job, but that the money was so good that he couldn't find another job that would come even close to it. He couldn't pay his rent. He couldn't, protect and support his family the way he wanted to. And so he remained in the job despite, the emotional experiences that he had while he was doing it.
Now, did you mention paranoia already as a symptom?
Paranoia is not actually a symptom. Paranoia in this case is more connected to hypervigilance, which is a way that we describe anxiety that is specific to PTSD. Paranoia is not actually a symptom of PTSD. It's not present in all situations. In this situation, it is present, and I believe it's present because of the marriage of the PTSD and some organic delusional or psychotic disorder that Mr. Loyd is suffering from that I believe predates these adult traumas that we're discussing.
All right, so I want to discuss a hypothetical for a second.
Okay.
Let's say a person who only is suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome is placed in a situation where there may or may not be an appearance of danger to him.
Okay. The most important thing to point there is that they perceive the danger.
Okay.
Because whether you think it's dangerous or not is immaterial. It's what's going on inside that person's head, whether they perceive they're in danger, whether their fight or flight response is triggered.
Okay, so what happens if they perceive the danger?
Well, it's specific to the individual. So in some cases, that's why they call it the fight or flight response. I actually have some patients in my clinical practice who insist that it's the fight, flight, or freeze response, because some of them just freeze like a deer in headlights and can't react. In this case, I spoke to Mr. Loyd about his particular response, and what he said is that he has no flight. He is all fight, that when he is threatened, he stands up and he protects himself and the people that he loves. He does not run. He doesn't believe in it. And again, this comes down to individual characteristics and personalities.
Now, how does that mix with someone who has a delusional disorder on top of that? So you have someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder and they have a delusional order.
From my perspective, it certainly makes things a lot more complicated. You know, for anyone, I'm sure that people have talked about this already today. I wasn't present, so I'm just going to kind of go over it again. But in terms of a delusional disorder, one of the things to remember is that it's not necessarily that you're just making things up out of thin air. It's like a dream. You know, there's a very famous story where, you know, well, I guess it's not a famous story. It's a famous story within my household. I apologize. My mother tells this story about being asleep, having a dream, and there are dogs chasing her, and they're barking and they're growling and the drool and all that stuff. And she jumps out of bed, like terrified, and my father is snoring next to her. And the sound of his snoring, she actually brought into her consciousness and encapsulated it into a dream. And that's similar to what we talk about with delusional disorders and psychotic disorders. It's not like they're looking around the room and they see space aliens, necessarily. Some people have those symptoms. I don't think we have that situation here. But they take instances that they see with their waking eyes and they incorporate them into this difficulty thinking rationally and being connected with reality. So what you've got here is, in the psychology world, we call it comorbidity, which is the idea we have two comorbid disorders. They occur at the same time. They're not necessarily connected in terms of how they were formed or how they were created, but they influence each other and they affect each other. And in this case, I do believe that the delusions that Mr. Loyd suffers from, which are mostly persecutory, based on the system being out to get him, things of that nature, that those, you know, intensify and worsen his PTSD symptoms, and certainly make functioning on a normal situation much more difficult for him.
Thank you, Doctor.
Welcome.
No further questions, Judge.
Ross?
Doctor, you went over a fairly lengthy list of different traumas that you say the defendant had experienced during his lifetime. When he would have a flashback, was there one that he flashed back to that was the most significant one?
He said that there were a couple. The most specific one he spoke about was the kidnapping. In the course of the DAPS, the Detailed Assessment of Post-Traumatic Stress, there is a section on the test where it asks you to identify your worst experience, the memory or the experience that stays with you to this day. And the kidnapping in particular was the one that he identified as that worst experience. He did also speak about the robberies while he was delivering chicken as those being ones that he saw with his waking eyes. But he did not mention the abuse during his childhood.
Now, you saw various police reports relating to different instances of trauma.
I saw a lot of police reports, yes.
Did you see any dealer with the kidnapping?
No, I did not.
So as to exactly what happened during this kidnapping event, you had to rely on the defendant's accurate report to you.
I had to rely on his self-report, correct.
And when you say that someone, what you describe avoidance behavior, they try to stay away from the things or the situations that trigger the PTSD. That correct?
Yes, they try and stay away from the things that bring about their anxiety, their re-experiencing symptoms, yes.
How did the PTSD affect Mr. Loyd's social life?
I don't know directly that it did affect his social life.
He still had relations, went out.
He still had friends. From what he told me, he still had friends. He still had social interactions. He still had girlfriends, things of that nature.
Refereed basketball games.
It's possible we didn't talk about that. I don't know.
And although he had this concern about the robberies, he still was able to work at the chicken delivery job.
He discussed that. He discussed the how difficult it was for him to go out at night, how his heart would start racing as he was getting dressed just to go to work and things like that. But what he said to me, as I said earlier, is that he felt like he couldn't pass up the money, that it was too good.
He still was able to go to work and do the job.
Yes, he still did it. Yes.
It did not interfere with his being able to do the job.
I can't speak to it, how much it may have interfered his ability to do the job well, but it did not keep him from doing the job in general.
Other than his thought processes, in what other part of his life did the PTSD impair his ability to function?
Well, I think the biggest thing from my speaking with him was that it certainly affected his demeanor on a daily basis, his ability to relax, his ability to sleep, things of that nature, his ability to relax. I also believe that, as I stated before, that his judgment, his ability to see whether something was dangerous or not dangerous, I believe was affected by his past experiences and his trauma symptoms.
I want to talk a little bit about this ACE examination that you used. That was not designed to detect PTSD.
No, it's not directly connected to PTSD in any way. It's, as I said, it's just to identify risk factors and to give us some connection to this wealth of information statistically.
And there are 10 questions,
Correct.
yes or no answers?
Yeah, there are 10 questions. Some of them are two-part questions. If you endorse one or the other, it's still considered a yes.
And it's limited to things that occurred before they were 18.
Correct.
And you simply ask them the question and you take their answer at face value.
Correct, yeah.
Now, for example, the second question, to the parent or other adult in the household often or very often punch, grab, slap, throw, or hit you so hard there were marks and injuries? Endorsed yes.
He did, on both part one and part two, yes.
And so much so that he related this where this mother would beat him so badly she just got exhausted and couldn't beat him anymore?
Well, he didn't relay that story to me directly when we were doing that, but we did later talk about that, yes.
Did you talk to any of the other doctors about whether or not he'd reported any such thing to them?
No, I did not.
You simply took his word for it and left it at that?
Correct.
Now, question number 8. Have you ever lived with somebody who's a problem drinker? Does the question differentiate between at what age or for how long?
No, it does not.
He was exposed to that?
No, it does not.
So a 16-year-old who lives with somebody for 3 months and is exposed to it would be yes.
Correct.
And someone who grows up with an alcoholic parent, they're virtually their entire youth, still gets yes.
Yes.
And question number 9, in regard to mental health in the family, he did not give a yes answer when you asked him the question?
He did not answer at all.
So you neither said yes nor no?
Correct.
So you went to other sources to find out the answer to that?
I spoke with the other experts, yes.
And they said, in their opinion, there had been mental health issues in the family?
Correct.
Did they identify who?
They spoke about his mother specifically, and he also had mentioned that he was concerned about his uncle. He did not say which uncle, but I asked the other experts about that as well, and they said they weren't sure.
So it's that answer. Okay. Now the other test is also a self-report test.
Yep.
Were you asked to form an opinion as to whether or not PTSD played any part in these murders?
Not directly, because I was asked specifically to do mitigation, but it was discussed at times, yes.
And it would be fair to say that your discussions with the defendant in regard to that issue would have been based upon his version of how they occurred?
Absolutely. They were based on, well, let me back up, I'm sorry. I did not discuss specifically PTSD as a factor with the defendant. The defendant told me his version of the story of the events, we discussed the events, we discussed how he felt, but I did not openly discuss PTSD with him in that way.
But again, that was based on his recitation of the facts and as they occurred.
Absolutely. It's based on his perception and his reporting of what happened that evening.
Thank you, Doctor. I have any other questions? Oh, I do have one other question, if I may, Your Honor. When you were initially hired, you were hired specifically to examine for PTSD?
Yes.
You were not asked to look at any other factors?
No.
Thank you. I have another question, John.
For your right.
Doctor, you had, the prosecutor asked you about the effect on his daily life?
Yes.
Question. Did he have any kind of trigger that was connected to nighttime?
Yes, he did.
Can you explain that to the jury?
He reported to me, again, that he had difficulty going out at night, that as it got dark, it would make him nervous. Most of the physical violence that he had experienced in his life had occurred at night. He felt that it was much more dangerous at night. I think that's pretty globally kind of understood. The cover of dark makes it easier to escape, I believe, or at least that's the thinking. And he reported being that night itself, as the sun was going down, that was a trigger for him, that would get his anxiety, his hypervigilance increased.
Thank you, Doctor. No further questions.
Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
All right, so let's take a longer break this time. 15 minutes. We'll see you back.
I'm sorry?
How many more witnesses do we have?
We have,
15 minutes.